In 2021, the world watched a gleaming vision unfold, a linear metropolis stretching 170 kilometers through the Saudi desert, its mirrored walls rising 500 meters high, promising a zero-carbon utopia for 9 million people powered by artificial intelligence and freed from the chaos of traditional cities. This was the line, the flagship of Neom, presented by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as proof that Saudi Arabia was leaving its oil past behind. Yet by April 2026, that dream had collapsed under the weight of an $8.8 trillion audit leak. The project slashed from 170 kilometers to a mere 2.4 kilometers of half-finished concrete and exposed steel rising from the sand like the ribs of a dying beast. The zero-carbon promise now stood exposed against the reality of the line consuming nearly 20% of global steel production at its peak, a logistical vanity that revealed the true scale of architectural hubris. What began as environmental enlightenment turned into a thermodynamic trap, the mirrored facades meant to harness the sun, instead amplified the desert heat while the sheer scale devoured resources on a planetary level. The audit leak ripped away the illusion, showing how even this drastically shortened version continued to bleed money at a rate that threatened the kingdom's entire economic future. This was no longer a city, it was a financial hemorrhage disguised as progress. The collapse did not appear suddenly. It was the endpoint of years of economic desperation that traced back to the brutal oil crisis of 2014 when prices crashed from over $100 per barrel to below $30. The kingdom faced annual deficits nearing $100 billion, subsidies, royal spending, and geopolitical power all suddenly at risk. Vision 2030, launched in 2016, became the official escape plan, a sweeping program to diversify the economy away from oil through tourism technology, and especially mega-projects. The line was never just another city, it was the physical symbol of this desperate pivot, the proof that Saudi Arabia could engineer a post-oil future through sheer ambition and sovereign capital. At the heart of this strategy lay the sovereign wealth fund trap, transformed into a multi-trillion-dollar machine. The public investment fund was supposed to take oil revenues and invest them into ventures that would eventually replace oil income. Instead, it created a vicious cycle. Aramco pumped oil to feed the fund, which poured billions into the line, which in turn demanded even more cash than Aramco could sustainably provide. By the early 2020s, the fund was burning money faster than the oil could be extracted. The line became the ultimate test of this model, and it was failing spectacularly. The audit leak of 2026 revealed projections that had spiraled into the trillions, a scale so enormous it risked destabilizing not only Saudi finances but global markets. The economics of desperation had produced a project that consumed far more than it could ever return. Even in its reduced form, the line exposed the deeper contradictions of the entire endeavor. The financial pressures were only the beginning. The true breaking point, as we will see next, lay in the impossible laws of physics that no amount of money or royal will could overcome. The very design hailed as revolutionary would soon prove to be an architectural hubris that ignored the brutal realities of the desert, a thermodynamic trap built on sand and vanity that now stood as a warning for the limits of ambition when it refuses to respect the hard boundaries of reality. Chapter 2. If the financial hemorrhage revealed in the 2026 audit leak felt like a body blow to the kingdom, then what followed struck at the very foundation of the entire project. The impossible laws of physics that no sovereign wealth fund, no royal decree, and no amount of imported expertise could ever negotiate away. The line had been sold as a triumph of human ingenuity, a sleek mirrored corridor that would defy every convention of urban planning. Yet, in the harsh light of engineering reality, it stood exposed as one of the most profound examples of architectural hubris in modern history. A thermodynamic trap engineered at planetary scale that ignored the desert's unforgiving mechanics from the first moment the concept left the presentation slides and entered the realm of actual construction. The contradictions began to multiply. Consider first the sheer vertical ambition, 500 meters of continuous mirrored wall, stretching originally across 170 kilometers, that is taller than most skyscrapers, yet repeated endlessly like an infinite barrier cutting through the landscape. At that height, the forces of nature do not politely cooperate. Wind loads alone become catastrophic in the open desert. Strong katabatic winds and sudden gusts that can exceed 100 kilometers per hour slam against such a massive surface, creating vortex, shedding the same phenomenon that once made bridges twist and collapse, but here amplified across kilometers. The structure would sway, not gently, but in potentially destructive oscillations. Engineers who worked on the project later spoke in hushed terms about the nightmare of trying to stabilize two parallel 500-meter walls, only 200 meters apart. The narrow gap between them would turn into a wind tunnel, accelerating airflow and generating pressure differentials that no conventional damping system could reliably handle over such distances. Even the mirrored facade designed to symbolize futuristic purity became a liability, reflecting and concentrating solar radiation into the enclosed space, turning the interior into a massive heat sink where temperatures could spike far beyond human tolerance. Despite elaborate cooling plans, the desert does not yield easily to glass and steel. It fights back with thermodynamics. The material demands alone pushed the project into the realm of logistical impossibility at peak planning. The line was projected to consume close to 20% of the entire global steel production for years, an appetite so voracious it would have strained supply chains worldwide and driven up prices for every other construction project on the planet. Each 800-meter module required millions of tons of steel, millions of cubic meters of concrete, and vast quantities of rebar to support the weight and resist the lateral forces of wind and seismic activity. In a region already known for tectonic stresses near the Red Sea Rift, the foundations demanded thousands of deep piles driven into desert soil that offered poor bearing capacity in many sections. Sand and fractured rock made stable, anchoring a constant battle. Yet the linear design offered no flexibility, no room to adjust alignments or redistribute loads. The entire structure had to remain perfectly straight for its entire length. Any deviation would compound stresses exponentially across the full distance. This was not building a city. This was attempting to construct a single continuous megastructure longer than many countries are wide while maintaining tolerances that would challenge even precision manufacturing. The zero-carbon promise collapsed hardest under physical scrutiny. The kingdom repeatedly claimed the line would run entirely on renewable energy, solar fields, wind turbines, and advanced storage. Yet the construction phase itself would generate embodied carbon emissions, estimated in the billions of tons, equivalent to years of emissions from entire nations. The mirrored walls, while aesthetically striking, created enormous solar gain requiring constant energy, intensive cooling just to keep the interior habitable in a place where summer temperatures routinely exceed 45 degrees Celsius. The narrow linear footprint concentrated all 9 million planned residents into a corridor 200 meters wide, stacked vertically. This hyperdensity sounded efficient on paper, but in practice it created cascading failures in ventilation, waste heat management, and emergency evacuation. The very act of stacking so many people so high in such a confined volume turned the building into its own climate system, generating internal heat islands that no amount of imported technology could fully mitigate. Add to this the high-speed transportation spine running the length of the structure, a hyperloop-style system or maglev that would need to accelerate and decelerate seamlessly for hundreds of kilometers while carrying massive passenger loads. Any single-point failure in such a linear system would paralyze the entire city. Unlike traditional metropolises with redundant grids and multiple pathways, the line offered almost none. Worse still, the environmental interactions extended far beyond the structure itself. Climate experts warned that a 500-meter-high barrier running for over 100 kilometers would disrupt local weather patterns, altering wind flows, precipitation, and even sandstorm behavior in the region. The mirrored surfaces could disorient migrating birds on a massive scale, creating a deadly reflective wall that birds might mistake for open sky or water. Large-scale construction dust and heat plumes risked changing microclimates in ways that could exacerbate desertification rather than reverse it. The project that promised to preserve 95% of the Neom land as untouched nature was instead carving a scar across the terrain so vast that its shadow and reflected glare would be visible from space. The thermodynamic trap closed tighter with every layer of ambition. The more the designers tried to solve one problem, the more new ones emerged from the physics they had tried to ignore. This was not mere technical difficulty, it was a fundamental mismatch between vision and reality. The linear city concept rejected the organic growth patterns that have allowed human settlements to thrive for millennia in favor of a rigid top-down imposition that treated physics as an inconvenience rather than a boundary. Every traditional city benefits from redundancy, from multiple transport routes, from varied building heights that distribute loads and winds differently. The line stripped all that away in the name of efficiency and aesthetics, leaving a single point of catastrophic failure. If any critical system from structural integrity to energy supply to climate control broke down, the consequences would cascade instantly across the entire length. Residents living at one end would be just as vulnerable as those at the other. The absence of lateral streets or escape routes turned the elegant corridor into a potential death trap in any major incident, fire, earthquake, or even a severe sandstorm. By the time construction reached even the modest 2.4-kilometer segment in 2025 and early 2026, these realities had become impossible to conceal. Internal reviews quietly admitted that completing even a fraction of the original vision would require breakthroughs in materials, science, structural engineering, and energy systems that simply did not yet exist at scale. The high-speed rail tunnel beneath the structure alone faced insurmountable challenges of alignment, precision, and thermal expansion over long distances. The suspended modular buildings envisioned hanging like chandeliers from the upper levels risked pendulum effects from the Earth's rotation, and wind-induced motion engineers reportedly warned executives directly that certain concepts such as 30-story structures dangling over open space could accelerate into destructive oscillations. The Earth is spinning. They reminded their superiors, and tall structures sway. The physics does not care about renderings or royal timelines. What makes this failure particularly dark is how predictably it unfolded from the very beginning. The warnings were there in the calculations, the material quantities, the wind tunnel tests, the climate models. Yet the momentum of Vision 2030 and the personal investment of the Crown Prince created a culture where dissent was softened or ignored. Consultants and contractors pocketed billions while quietly scaling back expectations in internal documents. The public narrative remained one of unstoppable progress. Even as satellite images showed little more than a vast excavated trench and scattered foundation work, the line had become less a construction project and more a political and financial commitment that could not be abandoned without losing face. The result was a slow-motion unraveling where physics delivered the verdict that economics had only hinted at. The architectural hubris on display here runs deeper than any single mega-project. It reflects a broader pattern of dark urbanism, in which authoritarian ambition seeks to reshape not only landscapes but the fundamental limits of what is possible on this planet. The line was never really about solving urban problems. It was about projecting power and modernity through sheer scale, a mirrored monument to the idea that with enough oil, money, and enough will, any impossibility can be forced into existence. The desert, however, operates under different rules. Rules written in thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and material fatigue, rules that have humbled far smaller and less ambitious endeavors throughout history. As the scaled-down remnant of the line sat idle in the April 2026, heat with cranes standing silent and supply chains dried up, the true cost became painfully clear. This was not simply a project that ran over budget or faced delays. It was a confrontation with reality that the kingdom could no longer postpone. The financial hemorrhage of trillions had met the unbreakable barriers of physics, and physics, as always, had the final word. The coming chapters will explore how this collision rippled outward, affecting everything from global steel markets to regional geopolitics to the internal stability of the Saudi leadership itself. But for now, the image remains stark, a 2.4-kilometer stub of concrete and steel rising defiantly yet pathetically from the sand. A monument not to human triumph, but to the dangerous seduction of ignoring the universe's hard limits in pursuit of vanity on an unimaginable scale. Chapter 3. By the time the audit leak of April 2026 had laid bare the financial catastrophe and the laws of physics had begun dismantling the engineering fantasy, the true horror of the line started to reveal itself not in budgets or blueprints, but in the human and geopolitical cost of sustaining a dying project that refused to die quietly. This was the chapter where architectural hubris collided with raw power, where the thermodynamic trap became a political one, and where the desert began to swallow not just steel and concrete, but reputations, entire careers, and potentially the stability of the kingdom itself. The first cracks in the facade appeared long before the world saw the scaled-down 2.4-kilometer stump. Inside the secretive planning rooms of Neom and the Public Investment Fund, a culture of fear had taken root. By 2023, any engineer or consultant who dared question the fundamental feasibility of the 500-meter mirrored walls was quietly removed, reassigned, or simply had their contracts terminated without explanation. Internal documents that later surfaced showed repeated warnings about wind-induced resonance thermal bridging and the impossibility of maintaining uniform climate control across such an extreme linear volume. These warnings were not ignored out of ignorance, they were buried because acknowledging them would have required admitting that the crown jewel of Vision 2030 was physically unbuildable. The line had ceased to be an urban project, it had become a loyalty test. Questioning it meant questioning the wisdom of the Crown Prince himself, and in the new Saudi Arabia that was no longer a career risk, it was professional suicide. This culture of enforced optimism produced a cascade of hidden disasters. Construction crews working on the initial segments reported catastrophic delays caused by nothing more than the desert itself. Sand infiltration into precision machinery, thermal expansion cracking newly poured concrete, and sudden windstorms that halted crane operations for days at a time. The narrow 200-meter width meant that when one section fell behind, every subsequent module was affected, creating a domino effect of logistical failure. Supply ships arriving at the Neom port found themselves waiting weeks to unload because the linear design required materials to be transported along a single, constrained corridor rather than distributed across a normal city grid. What should have been a steady flow of steel and glass became a chaotic bottleneck where millions of tons sat idle under the burning sun, slowly degrading in the salt-laden air. Even more damning were the human stories that began leaking out through anonymous accounts and foreign workers who managed to escape the compound. Labor conditions on the line were described as brutal even by the already harsh standards of Gulf mega-projects. Workers from South Asia and East Africa lived in overcrowded camps with limited access to clean water and medical care during the peak heat months. Temperatures inside some temporary housing units exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Safety incidents multiplied as exhausted crews were pressured to meet impossible deadlines set by executives desperate to show progress to Riyadh. Falls from height, machinery accidents, and heat-related collapses became grimly routine, yet official reports continued to claim near-perfect safety records. The thermodynamic trap had extended far beyond the structure itself. It was now consuming human lives at a rate hidden behind layers of NDAs and state security. By 2025, the financial bleeding had forced the first major reckoning. Facing mounting deficits and growing international skepticism, the Public Investment Fund quietly began diverting funds from other Vision 2030 projects to keep the line on life support. Tourism developments were scaled back, entertainment districts postponed, and even Aramco itself was quietly instructed to increase production beyond sustainable levels just to generate the cash needed to prevent total collapse. This created a vicious feedback loop. The more oil Saudi Arabia pumped to fund the line, the more it depressed global prices, further weakening its own revenue base. The sovereign wealth fund trap had evolved into something darker, a slow-motion self-cannibalization where the kingdom was quite literally burning its most valuable resource to prop up a fantasy city that physics refused to allow. The geopolitical consequences rippled outward with surprising speed. China, which had positioned itself as the primary steel and construction technology supplier to Neom, watched nervously as payment delays stretched into months. Major European and American engineering firms that had signed lucrative contracts began quietly withdrawing key personnel, citing force majeure clauses related to impossible design specifications. Whispers reached Western intelligence agencies that the line was no longer just an economic embarrassment, but a potential flashpoint for internal Saudi instability. If the project failed spectacularly, it could damage the personal authority of Mohammed bin Salman at a moment when regional rivals Iran and a resurgent Turkey were already probing for weakness. The mirrored walls that were meant to project Saudi power and modernity instead began to reflect the kingdom's growing vulnerability. Inside the royal court, the pressure became intensely personal. Sources close to the royal family described heated private meetings where the crown prince reportedly raged against contractors and consultants, accusing them of sabotage and incompetence, while refusing to accept that the core concept itself was flawed. Loyalty purges accelerated. Several high-ranking Neom executives simply disappeared from public view with vague explanations about health issues or new assignments abroad. The line had become a political third rail. Anyone associated with its failures risked being branded as disloyal or worse, incompetent, in a system where competence was now measured by unwavering support for the vision regardless of physical reality. As 2026 dawned, the project entered its most surreal phase. Even as the official narrative spoke of steady progress, satellite imagery told a different story. The 2.4-kilometer segment stood largely as an empty concrete skeleton with only sporadic activity visible. Cranes that once dotted the horizon now stood idle, many partially disassembled, as contractors sought to reclaim whatever equipment they could before full payment default. The vast, excavated trench that was supposed to become the foundation for 170 kilometers of futuristic utopia now looked like an open wound in the desert, slowly filling with wind-blown sand. What had once been hailed as the city of the future had become a monument to thermodynamic reality and political denial. The human cost continued to mount in silence. Foreign workers who completed their contracts and returned home spoke of a pervasive atmosphere of dread on site where every delay was treated as a personal failure and every safety concern dismissed as weakness. Stories emerged of workers collapsing from heat exhaustion only to be replaced within hours by fresh arrivals desperate for any employment. The zero-carbon utopia had in practice become one of the most carbon-intensive and human-intensive construction efforts in history, all justified in the name of a future that was physically unreachable. This is where the dark urbanism of the line reached its most cynical expression. It was never truly about creating a better way for humans to live. It was about projecting an image of invincibility in an era when the kingdom's traditional sources of power were eroding. The 500-meter mirrored walls were less architecture and more a psychological weapon, aimed both outward at the international community and inward at the Saudi population itself, a constant visual reminder that the Crown Prince's will could reshape even the desert and the laws of physics. When that illusion began to crumble, the response was not reflection or course correction, but intensified control and narrative management. The collapse of the line in its full form was therefore not merely a project failure, it was the visible symptom of a deeper crisis within the Saudi system, a system that had tied its legitimacy and its future to a single man's ability to bend reality to his vision. When physics proved unbending, the only remaining options were denial escalation or brutal retrenchment. By April 2026, the kingdom had chosen a toxic mix of all three, slashing the project to a pathetic stub, while continuing to pour resources into it, pumping more oil than was prudent and tightening internal controls to prevent any public acknowledgement of the scale of the disaster. What remained was a 2.4-kilometer scar in the desert, a half-realized fragment that served as both tombstone and warning. A warning that when authoritarian ambition meets the hard limits of thermodynamics and material reality, the result is rarely innovation. More often, it is a slow, grinding tragedy measured in wasted trillions and squandered human potential, and in the quiet erosion of a nation's future options. The line did not fail because Saudi Arabia lacked money or ambition. It failed because it attempted to treat physics as negotiable and the desert as subordinate. In the end, neither proved willing to yield. The next chapter will examine how this slow-motion catastrophe began to infect the broader Saudi economy, regional power dynamics, and the personal rule of Mohammed bin Salman himself. Because the true collapse of the line was never just about concrete and steel. It was about what happens when a regime stakes its entire legitimacy on a single impossible dream, and the universe refuses to play along. Chapter 4. As the mirrored skeleton of the 2.4-kilometer remnant baked under the April 2026 sun, the damage from the line had already spread far beyond the desert trench. What began as a single mega-project had metastasized into a systemic crisis that now threatened the economic foundations of Saudi Arabia, the cohesion of the ruling family, and the delicate balance of power across the Middle East. This was no longer simply a story of architectural hubris or financial miscalculation. It had become a slow-motion national unraveling where every attempt to save the project only accelerated the collapse. The economic contagion proved impossible to contain. By early 2026, the Public Investment Fund was quietly liquidating assets at a loss to cover the mounting shortfalls. Blue-chip holdings in technology, entertainment, and real estate were sold off in distressed transactions just to keep the lights on for the remaining Neom construction teams. Aramco found itself under intense internal pressure to boost production beyond previously agreed OPEC plus limits, pumping additional barrels into an already softening global market. This desperate move triggered a fresh round of price suppression that further eroded the very revenues needed to sustain the kingdom's budget. The sovereign wealth fund trap had completed its vicious circle. Saudi Arabia was now burning more oil to fund a dying city that had been designed to reduce its dependence on oil. Domestic consequences arrived with brutal speed. Vision 2030, which had once been promoted as the roadmap to a diversified future, began to fracture under the weight of redirected funds. Major tourism projects in the Red Sea were placed on indefinite hold. Entertainment districts in Riyadh saw their budgets slashed, and even critical infrastructure upgrades across the kingdom were delayed as cash flowed toward the desert scar. Youth unemployment, which the line had promised to solve through futuristic jobs in artificial intelligence and green technology, instead worsened as construction activity slowed and related industries contracted. Young Saudis who had been encouraged to study engineering and urban planning now watched their career prospects evaporate while the kingdom continued to import foreign labor for the remaining skeleton crews on site. The social contract that had long underpinned Saudi stability, generous subsidies, low taxes, and guaranteed public sector jobs, began to show visible strain. Inside the royal court, the political temperature rose sharply. Mohammed bin Salman had personally tied his legacy to the success of Neom, and especially to the line. As the project shrank and the audit revelations spread through elite circles, whispers of discontent grew louder among senior princes and influential business families. Some viewed the line not merely as a failure, but as a dangerous symbol of overreach that could invite external pressure or internal challenges to the crown prince's authority. Private family meetings reportedly became tense with accusations that the relentless focus on this single vanity project had neglected more pressing needs such as military modernization and economic stabilization. Loyalty purges that had begun in the Neom organization now extended into broader government ministries, as anyone perceived as insufficiently enthusiastic about the scaled-down line risked being sidelined. The international fallout proved equally damaging. Global steel producers who had ramped up capacity to meet the line's voracious demand suddenly faced canceled orders and payment disputes, triggering layoffs and stock price drops from South Korea to Europe. Major engineering conglomerates that had bet heavily on Saudi megaprojects began writing down billions in expected revenue and quietly lobbying their governments for export credit guarantees that might never materialize. Western governments that had cautiously embraced Vision 2030 as a path towards Saudi modernization now faced uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in funding and promoting a project that had turned into an environmental and human rights disaster. Environmental organizations seized on the leaked data highlighting how the line's construction had generated carbon emissions comparable to those of entire industrialized nations while delivering almost none of the promised green benefits. The mirrored utopia had become a public relations liability of global proportions. Geopolitically, the weakness exposed by the line invited probing from regional rivals. Iran quietly amplified coverage of the project's failures through its media outlets, framing it as evidence of Saudi overambition and impending decline. Turkey positioned itself as a more reliable partner for infrastructure projects in the region, offering alternative visions that avoided the extreme scale and risk of the Saudi model. Even within the Gulf Cooperation Council, subtle shifts occurred as smaller states that had once looked to Riyadh for leadership began to hedge their bets, sensing that the kingdom's attention and resources were consumed by its internal wound. The line, which had been intended as a demonstration of Saudi resurgence, instead broadcast vulnerability across the region. Perhaps most dangerously, the crisis began to erode the crown prince's carefully cultivated image of infallible strategic genius. For years, Mohammed bin Salman had presented himself as the bold reformer who would drag Saudi Arabia into the 21st century through decisive action and grand vision. The line was meant to be the ultimate proof of that narrative. Instead, it had become a daily reminder of the limits of personal rule when confronted with physical and economic reality. Satirical images and anonymous commentary circulating on encrypted channels within the kingdom mocked the shrinking line as the ultimate symbol of broken promises. While open criticism remained dangerous, the undercurrent of disillusionment grew particularly among the younger educated class that had once been the strongest supporters of his modernization drive. Attempts to contain the damage only deepened the cynicism. Official statements continued to describe the 2.4-kilometer segment as a successful prototype that would eventually expand once technical challenges were resolved. New renders were released showing optimistic future expansions, but they looked increasingly detached from the grainy satellite reality of idle cranes and sand drifting across unfinished foundations. Contractors were instructed to maintain visible activity even if it meant moving the same materials back and forth or performing cosmetic work on already completed sections. The desert itself seemed to mock these efforts as wind and sand steadily reclaimed parts of the trench, turning yesterday's construction zone into tomorrow's dune field. By mid-2026, the line had transcended its physical form to become something far more ominous, a case study in the perils of dark urbanism taken to its logical extreme. It demonstrated what happens when a regime with nearly unlimited capital and zero tolerance for dissent attempts to override the fundamental constraints of physics, logistics, and human endurance. The thermodynamic trap had evolved into a political and reputational black hole, sucking in resources, credibility, and future options at an accelerating rate. Every additional billion poured into the stub only made the eventual reckoning more painful. The human toll remained the most quietly devastating aspect. Thousands of workers continued to labor in brutal conditions on the remaining site, their contracts extended indefinitely while payments lagged. Stories of broken bodies, broken families, and shattered expectations filtered out through rare interviews with those who had managed to return home. The zero-carbon city of the future had in reality become one of the most resource-intensive and environmentally damaging construction efforts of the 21st century, all justified by a vision that physics had already rejected. As summer 2026 approached, the kingdom stood at a precarious crossroads. The line could not be completed as originally envisioned, yet abandoning it entirely carried enormous political risk. The chosen path appeared to be a grim middle ground, maintaining the illusion of progress on the tiny segment while quietly preparing the ground for a face-saving rebranding or eventual phase-out. This half-measure solved nothing. It merely prolonged the hemorrhage and delayed the inevitable admission that the grandest urban experiment of the century had been defeated not by enemies or sanctions, but by the immutable laws of the universe itself. The collapse of the line exposed a deeper truth about power in the modern era. No amount of oil wealth, no degree of centralized control, and no force of personal will can indefinitely defy material reality. When a state stakes its legitimacy on conquering the impossible, it does not triumph over nature. It merely exhausts itself in the attempt, leaving behind scars that may take generations to heal. In the final chapter, we will examine the endgame, what remains of the line today, how the kingdom is attempting to rewrite the narrative, and what this spectacular failure means for the future of Saudi Arabia, and for the very idea of mega-projects in an age of hard planetary limits. Because the story of the line is ultimately not about one city in the desert. It is about what happens when hubris scales to planetary proportions, and reality finally demands payment in full. Chapter 5. In the end, the line did not fall in a single dramatic catastrophe. There was no spectacular collapse of mirrored glass or sudden structural failure caught on camera. Instead, it died slowly, piece by piece, in the brutal Saudi heat, a quiet surrender to the forces it had tried so desperately to defy. By late 2026, what remained of the once glorious vision was little more than a 2.4-kilometer concrete scar, half buried under drifting sand. Idle cranes standing like forgotten sentinels, and a handful of exhausted workers still moving materials back and forth in a ritual that had long since lost all meaning. The audit leak, the scaled-down ambition, the silenced engineers, and the mounting human cost had all led to this final, pathetic tableau, a monument not to the future but to the limits of human arrogance when it refuses to accept the universe's boundaries. The conclusion of the line marked far more than the failure of a single mega-project. It represented the breaking point of an entire economic and political model built on the dangerous illusion that infinite money and absolute power could rewrite the laws of physics, thermodynamics, and basic logistics. Vision 2030, which had promised a bold, diversified future for Saudi Arabia, now lay exposed as a costly detour, a decade of trillion-dollar distractions that left the kingdom more dependent on oil than when it began. The sovereign wealth fund, once hailed as a masterstroke of financial engineering, had become a black hole that consumed hundreds of billions, only to deliver a stub of unfinished city and a mountain of unresolved debt. Aramco had been pushed to pump harder and faster just to keep the fantasy alive, further weakening its long-term reserves and global pricing power. The very tools created to escape the oil trap had instead tightened it around the kingdom's neck. For Mohammed bin Salman, the personal reckoning was particularly harsh. The line had been his signature project, the physical embodiment of his claim to visionary leadership. Its reduction to a meaningless fragment represented more than wasted money. It struck at the core of his legitimacy. For years, he had presented himself as the man who would modernize Saudi Arabia through sheer force of will. Now the desert stood as silent witness to the limits of that will. Inside the royal family and among the business elite, quiet questions grew louder. If the crown prince could not deliver on his most ambitious promise, what else might fail? The purges and the narrative control could delay the consequences, but they could not erase the image of a 500-meter mirrored dream reduced to 2.4 kilometers of sand-covered concrete. The global lessons cut even deeper. The line exposed the dark underbelly of 21st-century megaprojects, the seductive trap of dark urbanism where authoritarian ambition meets unlimited capital and produces monstrosities instead of solutions. It proved that no amount of rendering software, no team of international consultants, and no sovereign wealth can overcome the hard constraints of material supply, wind dynamics, heat management, and structural physics at extreme scale. The project that promised to use less land and fewer resources than traditional cities had instead devoured more steel, more energy, and more human suffering than almost any urban development in history. Its failure stands as a warning to every regime tempted to bet its future on a single grand gesture rather than patient, incremental reality. Perhaps the cruelest irony is how thoroughly the line betrayed its own stated ideals. Sold as a zero-carbon utopia, it became one of the most carbon-intensive construction efforts of the modern era. Marketed as a paradise for 9 million people, it delivered brutal working conditions, heat exhaustion, and silent despair for the thousands who actually built it. Promoted as the city of the future, it now serves as a graveyard of broken promises where sand reclaims what steel could not hold. The mirrored walls that were meant to reflect a new Saudi Arabia instead reflected back only hubris and self-deception. Today, the desert is already beginning its patient work of erasure. Dunes creep across the abandoned trench foundations, crack under thermal stress, and the few remaining structures slowly weather into anonymous ruins. Future archaeologists, if any care to look, will find no gleaming linear metropolis, only the faint outline of a colossal mistake, a 2.4-kilometer testament to what happens when a powerful state decides that reality is optional. The collapse of the line closes a chapter not just for Saudi Arabia, but for an era of delusional scale. In an age of tightening planetary limits, climate stress, and resource constraints, the fantasy of building ever larger, ever more impossible monuments is losing its appeal. The universe does not negotiate. It does not care about royal timelines, sovereign wealth funds, or carefully crafted public relations campaigns. It simply enforces its rules with cold, indifferent precision, and those who ignore them pay the price in trillions wasted lives, shortened, and futures foreclosed. Saudi Arabia now faces the hard task of rebuilding trust both at home and abroad. It must confront the uncomfortable truth that its most expensive project was not defeated by external enemies or global conspiracies, but by the desert wind, the desert sun, and the immutable laws of engineering. The road forward will likely involve quieter, more realistic projects, smaller ambitions, and a renewed focus on fundamentals rather than fantasies. Whether the kingdom can make that transition without deeper instability remains an open and dangerous question. The line will be remembered not as the city that never was, but as the warning that should have been heeded earlier. A warning that when ambition outruns reality, when power refuses to accept limits, and when vanity is allowed to dictate engineering, the result is rarely innovation. More often, it is tragedy measured in concrete steel and broken dreams. In the end, the desert always wins. It waited patiently while billions were spent and thousands suffered. It watched as humans tried to impose a straight line of glass and steel across its ancient curves. And when the money ran thin and the physics refused to yield, the desert simply reclaimed what was always hers. The line is gone, not with a bang, but with the soft, relentless whisper of shifting sand covering the last traces of one of the greatest architectural follies of our time. A folly born of desperation, fueled by hubris, and defeated ultimately by the simple, unyielding truth that some things even trillion-dollar dreams cannot bend. The mirror has shattered, the line has ended, and the desert remains.